Wo landen diese Sachen? Wo landen diese Instrumente? Was wird daraus?
Hello, and welcome to our final meeting of the 2021-2022 academic year. Final official meeting, sorry. Correction, this is the final workshop. We are going to have a meeting next week in person. I'll talk a little bit about this later. But I just wanted to hop on before Jeremy starts his workshop tonight and give you the results of the 2022 election. Oh no. We're fine. We're covered. So this year, we had 79% of official or valid voters fill out their own ballots. So that's 19 out of 24 people. And that's up from both previous years. This has been our third election so far, and this is the highest voter turnout we've ever had. So that's good. We're moving up there. So now I'm just going to go through each candidate and what the ballot said. So for president, Yasmin was running and she received 17 yeas, 1 nay, and 1 abstain, which means that she is elected. For vice president, we had Dan. He received 17 yeas, 1 nay, and 0 abstains. So he is elected. For VP Finance, we had Greg running. He received 19 yeas, 0 nays, 0 abstains. So he is elected. For VP Operations, Miriam ran. She received 18 yeas, 0 nays, and 1 abstain. So she is also elected. For VP Communications, Mariana ran. And she received 19 yeas, 0 nays, and 0 abstains. So she is also elected. For VP Tech, we had 3 who were running. There are 3 spots to fill. So for our first VP Tech, we had Delora running. She received 19 yeas, 0 nays, and 0 abstains. So she's also elected. For our second slot for VP Tech, Ethan ran. And he received 19 yeas, 0 nays, and 0 abstains. So he's also elected. And our final position is also our final VP Tech, Ned ran. And he received 19 yeas, 0 nays, and 0 abstains. So he is also elected. Thus, so far, everyone who ran is elected, and this will be our new executive board for the upcoming academic year. The current executives will serve their term until April 30th. This entire month will likely be giving knowledge over, doing knowledge transfers between the executive positions, and then this new executive team comes into power. I would like to note that you might, as it was noted last time, and you might have noticed there was no VP secretary. No secretary ran for this election. I would keep your eyes open if getting involved with the club is something you'd be interested in at a deeper level. The new executive team will likely put out a application. That's the word I'm looking for. An application for that. And they will be trying to fill that position. So keep your eyes open if you're looking to do more with this club. So I just wanted to quickly do some housekeeping notes. They're very short because it is the end of the year. But next week is our final meeting, April 11th. It's the end of the semester. And so we decided, instead of doing a workshop and trying to fill our brains with more knowledge at this time of the year, when we're all very stressed with school, that we would instead just have a very casual hangout. A lot of this club has been done entirely online. Tons of people do not even know what each other looks like. And so we should finally meet each other's faces. So we have Math Sciences 319. That's the 3rd floor. In the brick building. For those of you who are a little new to campus, you can always message one of the execs if you can't find it. We will help you find it. Some of us have been at school for a very long time. So we have Math Sciences 319 reserved from 6 p.m. till 8 p.m. Mountain Standard Time on April 11th. That's next week, Monday. We need all attendees to fill out the form. I will put it in chat as well, and it's also in the Discord announcements. But we need you to fill out this form in order to be able to hold things on campus. It's requirements of the SU. We also ask that if you do attend, you comply with all U of C COVID-19 restrictions. So please wear a mask the entire time. That's the big one. Wear a mask the entire time. Don't let us spread something around, and fill out the form 24 hours before. If you have not filled out the form, we are closing it 24 hours before, and we're not allowed to let you in. So please just make sure you do that. And we're not going to do anything like security related, I don't believe, or there are no plans to. We could change our minds. But we are just planning on playing some Jackbox games together on a big screen and finally meeting each other. Additionally, last year around this time, we announced the Orchid Leaderboard Top 10, but as you may have noted, today there's still another workshop, so there is still chance to get flags and have movement on that leaderboard. This year at the final meeting, we are going to be giving prizes to the top 3 on that leaderboard. So there are tons of flags out in the wild. I gave a little hint last week into where some extra ones are, but a lot of the workshops remain, especially with the ones with static files, remain up and running and have flags. And there are flags in tonight's workshop that can create movement along the leaderboard. So if you want to get one of those top 3 prizes, work really hard because there's still lots of chance for you to win. So I will be announcing that leaderboard next meeting. Thank you so much for supporting our club over the year. It's really fun to run it and be a part of it. And I just want to thank everyone who supports us and makes it happen. I'm now going to invite Jeremy on, where he is going to give his workshop.
Hey. All right. Let me get set up because I didn't actually set up my screen share before. Screen 1. Yeah. Let's move all of you guys out of here. And let's get the presentation in. Sorry, just give me a second to set this up. And I think the second that I present this, you're going to get the presenter view. Yeah. Display settings, swap. And there, I think you guys should be able to see the right screen now. Everything should be okay. All right. Final workshop for this year. I know that if you were here at last week's meeting, you might have heard that we were going to be doing Log4j. That fell through and has been replaced. So we've pulled the old switcheroo on you, and you've gone for what is sort of a in the news hot topic to, that's right, binary exploitation, your favorite category. I know. You can't hide it. But this is Binary Exploitation 2 Electric Boogaloo, a workshop that we did in our first semester of the club at the end of that year, and we haven't seen it for quite a while. So we pulled it out, and it's a pretty quick and easy one, not too complicated. So let's sort of get to it. First, our goals for this workshop are to learn about and execute an integer overflow. So we're going to see what those are, sort of understand how they work, and run them. And then we're going to learn about string vulnerabilities and format string vulnerabilities specifically. That's something that you would see in Computer Science 525 if you took it, Dr. Henry's course in programming vulnerabilities and programming security. There's lots you can do with it. We're just going to sort of lightly go over what it is and show some of the basics, not as much as you would see in that course. So this is sort of a primer if you end up doing that course eventually, which I'd recommend. It's a good course. Yeah, both of these things would help you in a class like that. So tools for this workshop are terminal. Really nothing fancy today. All you need is some Linux to be able to run some binaries that I have set up and put in the workshop materials channel on our Discord server. So to download those files, go to our Discord server. There is a file, it's called be2.zip. Download that into wherever your Linux machine is, and you will run those binaries to do the little exercises and the 2 challenges that are in this workshop today. Moving on. Part 1 of this workshop is going to be integer overflows. So we're going to start out with a quick review of binary, because there are some people here who are in first year. You're doing Python, you're doing Java, but binary is not something that you have to know for your first year of computer science at the U of C. So we're going to go over it pretty simply. And the way I like to start explaining how binary works to people is to explain how our regular decimal number system works. So binary is a base 2 system. The number system that we use is a base 10 system. And so we see this number 135. We just know what this number is. It's 135. But that's because we've grown up with it and we know how to interpret this number, and we just implicitly know what this number represents. But there is a way that you can interpret this number that we don't really think about, and understanding how to do that is useful to understanding how binary works. So each of these numbers represents a power of 10. And so the first digit is the ones digit. This represents 5 ones. Or you can think about it as 10 to the 0 times 5. So 10 to the 0 is 1, and times 5 is 5. So there are 5 ones in this number. The next spot represents 10 to the power of 1, or the tens. And so this means, we know that that number means that it's 30. So we can also say that there are 3 tens. So that's 10 to the 1 times 3. So we'll add that in to our total. And then we move right along. And this is 10 to the power of 2. So it's the 100 spot we know. And there's one of those. And we can add that in with our total. And if we add these all up, that gives us the number 135. So that's sort of a very technical way of looking at our base 10 number system, and how those numbers are actually calculated. So if you can understand this and what this is, then it's just a quick little jump to understanding how it works in binary. So in binary, we have ones and zeros. In our base 10 system, we have 10 digits, 0 through 9. In binary, we have 2 digits, 0 and 1. And so each spot in a binary representation represents some power of 2, in the same way that in the other case, it was some power of 10. So in the first case, it's 2 to the power of 0, so 1. And in this case, we have, let me just get my laser pointer out here. Where did it go? There it is, sorry. In the first spot here, we have a 1. So that's 2 to the power of 0 times 1, which we know is going to be the number 1. So we add a 1 in there. This is 2 to the power of 1 times 0. Anything times 0 is, of course, 0. So that number doesn't really count. We're not going to add that in. There's nothing in that spot. But that's the 2 spot. The next one is 2 to the power of 2. So this is the 4 spot. And there's a 1 there. So it's 2 to the power of 2 times 1. That's 4. So we're going to add 4 into our total. And then we just keep moving along. 2 to the power of 3, so that's 8. So we have 1 8 in our total. 2 to the power of 4 times 0 is going to be 0. Don't care about that one. And then 2 to the power of 5, if you can remember your powers of 2, that's going to be 32. And so we've got one of those. So we'll add it into our total. And then you would have to do this math and add it all up. And you would find out that this number in binary is actually in decimal the number 45. And so that's the sort of way that you're supposed to calculate binary. The way that I remember it is always just the first spot is a 1, and then it goes 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. And each time you jump a number, you double by 2. So you start with 1, double it to 2, double it to 4, double it to 8, double it to 16, double it to 32, and on and on and on. And if there's a 1 there, you add that number in. So you add the 1, you don't add 2, you add 4, you add 8, you don't add 16, you add 32. And by doing that, you can convert binary into decimal pretty quickly in your head for at least these low numbers. Once you start getting into the higher up numbers, you have to start adding really big numbers, and it's difficult. But that's just an overview of how binary works. And that's going to come in helpful because we're going to get into how these numbers are represented and how they overflow. So the question is, now that you know how binary works, what is this number in decimal? This number right here, feel free to toss it into the chat if you've got it. I'll give you guys another 10 seconds while I take a drink of water here, very slowly. All right, we've got someone tossing up an answer. Someone here is saying that's 13. That's partially correct. That is a correct answer, but there's more than one answer to what this is in decimal. And to understand why, we're going to start jumping into why that could be. So the correct answer to this is that it depends. It really depends on the sort of terms that you're laying out and what the situation is. So what does it depend on? It depends on two main things. It'll depend somewhat on your system architecture, whether you're on a 32 or 64-bit machine. That will change the numbers sometimes, depending on how many bits or the sort of architecture and how much your machine can hold in terms of numbers. But it'll mostly depend on the integer properties that you're looking for. Specifically, what I'm wondering is this a signed or is it an unsigned number? Why does that matter? Well, first, let's look at the architecture. So if we're working with 32 bits, that's 32 bits, and that's the number 2 using 32 bits. Each one of these things is a bit. And a 64-bit machine, because, you know, who doesn't have the time to write out 64 bits for the number 2? That's what the number 2 looks like. And in your machine, this is how it holds that data. So if you were to tell it that I want a number, it's going to be 30. I want you to hold a number using 32 bits, and that number is 2. This is what it looks like inside of your computer. If you have a 64-bit architecture, this is what it looks like down here. So this is to say that if I gave you a very, very big binary number that was bigger than 32 bits, and I asked you what that number was, if your computer works with only 32 bits, it could only read the first 32 bits of that number. So that's why architecture sometimes matters. Usually, though, we don't have to worry about this. The big thing that we have to worry about is the actual range or the size of the number or the binary number that we're dealing with. So we're going to deal with integers. And integers in most programming languages are 32 bits. They use 32 bits to store them. And so if, for example, this is 32 bits, and if we flip all of the bits on, this is the number that we get. So this is the highest number that we can make with 32 bits in the usual way that we represent binary data. That number, of course, is 4,294,967,295. And that's how many numbers, actually we can represent 4,297,967,296 numbers with 32 bits, because remember, 0 counts as a number. If all the bits are flipped off, that number is 0. We get up to this number right here. So that counts for 1 more with the 0, and that's how many numbers we can represent with it. Cool, you're saying. Jeremy, you're opening my eyes to the world of 32-bit and the world of binary. Yeah, it's pretty great. But remember when I said it depends on if the number is signed or unsigned. And this matters because when we program, we can represent numbers as positive or negative. There is a way to do negative numbers. Remember in what I showed you here, these are only positive numbers that it can show. It can show you from 0 to this number up here. But if we want to show negative numbers, we need to come up with a different way of doing it. So we've already seen unsigned ints in C. They cannot represent negative numbers. This is why they are called unsigned. And that's the number that we were looking at earlier. So that's the biggest number we can go to with unsigned. But if we use signs, so if we use positive and negative numbers, 0 to our big 4 billion friend. But if we use ints in C, and ints are signed by default. So if you've ever been using an int, you've probably been using a signed integer, maybe without knowing it. They're signed by default, which means that they can be negative. And what we do is we separate this range that it can represent, this 4 billion number. We essentially just cut it in 2. So we can go 2.1 billion into the negatives and 2.1 billion something up into the positives. So we can represent all of these numbers with a 32-bit signed integer. You're saying, wow, that's great. Great. And it works the same way. If we use 64-bit, then it just doubles the amount of numbers. They just get way bigger and they go out on each side. But the important thing to understand is that integers can be both signed and unsigned. But there's a way we have to do this in binary. So we see this up here. This is a binary number. we only know how to look at this and think of it as positive numbers. I'm going to show you how we can represent negative numbers in binary. We don't do it by just putting a negative symbol at the start, because computers, of course, don't understand negative symbols. They understand ones and zeros. So how does a computer go negative? And the usual way, there's a lot of ways to do this, but the most common way is to use a system called 2's complement. 2's complement, the way that this works is you take the positive representation of a number in binary, then you change the zeros to ones and the ones to zeros. So you flip the bits, essentially. All zeros become ones, all ones become zeros. And then you add 1 to the number. So let me show you. Here's the number 7 in decimal. To represent it in binary, we would do this. So one more time. This is 1 plus 2 plus 4, which equals 7. So this is the 7 in its positive representation. So you're used to being able to do this in binary. So that's 7. Then we flip the bits. So ones become zeros and zeros become ones. And then we add 1 to the number, and that's going to be -7 in binary. It's going to be -7 if we do this as a signed number, if the binary is signed. And the thing that you will find if you do this over and over with all kinds of numbers, we'll give our example first. So 1101, our number before, somebody said it was 13, and I said that's partially right. That is right. It depends. And the reason is that 1101 can be 13. So that's 1 plus 4 plus 8 will be 13. Or we can use our 2's complement and we just reverse that process that we did. We subtract 1 from the binary. We flip all of the bits. So that number then becomes 3, which means that this number could be -3 if it was a signed integer. So this number could have been 13, or it could have been -3 were the answers to that question. And got to give some credit. This person who said 13 originally jumped and then said -2. Pretty close, but they recognized that it could have been a negative number. So good catch. That's what I was trying to catch you up on. Yeah, so that's the way that you could have translated this number. You could have said it was 13, which it is, or it could also be -3. It depends on how you're interpreting the binary number. So if somebody ever shows you a binary number and says, what number is this? You might want to ask them some questions. And it's going to depend on something very specific, which we'll go into now, which is, there we go, yep, 13 or -3, which is, what is the sign bit or the most significant bit? And this is going to be the bit on the left-hand side. We call this the most significant bit, the biggest, the one that represents the largest number in however many binary digits you have. Conversely, the one on the other end is the least significant bit. But if you're representing numbers using signs, so positive and negatives, this is also known as the sign bit. So if someone shows you a binary number and says, what number is this? And you see right away that the first binary digit, the most significant bit, is a 1, that's a clue to you that that could be a negative number. If you interpret it as a signed number, then that could be a negative number that the binary is representing. So if you did that 2's complement thing that I showed you, every time you try to get a negative number, this most significant bit is going to be flipped. Is going to be a 1. So if you see a 1 at the start, that could be a negative number. And that's just a heads up. And this is how the computer figures out whether a number is positive or negative. It just looks at that top one and says, is it signed? Okay. Is the top one, is the top thing a 1? Okay, then it's going to be a negative number. So as for an example, this number here, so this number is just underneath where the first 1 or the most significant bit turns into a 1. So if we add 1 to this number here, this is the binary that it turns up to. So all of these ones the 1 turns into a 0, it carries a 1, turns into a 0, carries a 1. So this is what it looks like. I promise you these are the same number of digits. It's just the way the font makes the zeros really wide. So this is this number added with a 1. And so that number could be this decimal number plus 1, or because the most significant bit is a 1, if it's a signed number that you're dealing with, it could be this number, which is wildly confusing, I'm sure, if you've never seen this before. Like, numbers change and wrap around depending on, like, if you add 1 to it, suddenly the number becomes negative. And this is the core of what the integer overflow is. This is the thing that you have to understand, and it can be a little tricky to wrap your head around sometimes. So the way to think of it is, if you're dealing with signed numbers, that you can go from, with 32 bits, you can go from this negative 2 billion number to this positive 2 billion number, or from positive 2 billion to negative. So the numbers wrap around, and you can think of it sort of like a clock. A clock counts from 1 to 12, and at 12, it goes back to 1. That's the similar sort of wraparound effect that this has. So you can go far enough up in these numbers, and then suddenly, when you add 1 to the number, the binary flips the most significant bit, and suddenly the number becomes negative. And it also works in the opposite way, which is a hint for one of the challenges that's coming up. If you wrap around this way, this is called integer overflow. So you've overflowed the size that you can hold. And when you do that, when you go too high, the number suddenly becomes negative. So you've overflowed the integer. If you go the other way, it's called an integer underflow. So you go into the negative numbers far enough, and suddenly the number jumps up to a positive number. And the reason that we're talking about this in the security context is because this is sort of unexpected behavior most times. Most people aren't going to use numbers if they're going to do this. You don't want, I don't know, accounting software that's going to make so much money that it suddenly becomes negative. That makes no sense. So usually when this happens, it's unintended. And I'm going to show you a few examples of that soon. So go ahead and give it a try. I've given you I've given you a zip file. There's 5 binaries in it. Go ahead and play with the first one. It's called Fun with Ints. The task here is to see if you can get it to display 2 different numbers by typing them in the same way twice. So you're going to type in 2 numbers. I want you to type the same number twice, and the computer's then going to print them out for you. And I want to see if you can make it print out 2 different numbers. So I'm going to give you about a minute to play around with this. While you do this, I'm going to also do this. All right, anyone managed to get it yet? Toss it in the chat if you have. And by playing around with it, you should be able to see, based on what we've looked at so far, that you can put in numbers that are big or small enough for it to print out 2 different numbers. So you might have seen what I did there earlier. I wrote -1, and then same number again, -1. It says that the first number is -1, and the second number is our old friend, that 4 billion number. That's weird. Let's see if we copy this number and run it again. And paste. Now the numbers are different again. And you might notice that that first number is just about half of what the second number is. And if you're paying attention, you should notice that it's because the first number it's printing out is signed and the second number is unsigned. So the unsigned number can go way higher. It can double the amount. But if it goes negative, if we put a negative number in, the first print statement can print a negative number because it's interpreting it as unsigned. But the second print statement wraps it around. So -1 goes way back up to 4 billion. So now try the same thing with the second binary called fun with int 2. See if you can get it to display two different numbers with opposite signs. This may also, the program, these are really toy programs. You might be able to get a seg fault with it. I can't remember. But yeah, play around with it and see what you can find. Yes, so this program is actually comparing these numbers to see if they're the same, and then we'll tell you whether or not they are. Try to get it to print two different numbers. So put the same number in twice, but it'll get it to print two different numbers and say that they are the same number. And 1 or 2 more seconds. Shouldn't have taken you too long based on the first one to try some of the things that I'd told you. So I'm going to run it again. So it's going to take a number and it's going to multiply it by 10. So let's put 5 in, multiplies it by 10, 50 signed, 50 unsigned, same numbers, yes. Let's do the trick we used before. So -1 and -1. The signed number is -10. The unsigned number is some 4 billion number. Are these the same number? And the program says, yes, they are. The program thinks that these numbers are the same. What it's doing, and I think there are ways that it doesn't quite work. What it's doing is actually comparing the binary for these two numbers and checking out to see if the binary representation is the same. It's printing them as signed and unsigned numbers, but the binary for both of them is just going to be the same. It's just the way that it's reading it out when it prints it. We're going to see that a little later. But that's how that works. And so after that, I've been talking for a while, and you can play with the ATM program. There is a flag hidden in this program. I tried to make this deployable so you could netcat into it and run it there. It gave me lots of grief, so I'm just giving you the binary. Don't just reverse it and get the string out of it. That would be the easy and cheating way. And if you do that, you won't learn nothing. This program is, I guarantee you, going to be a little bit tricky, but it's pretty straightforward to get it to give you a flag. But we're going to keep going. I'm not going to take like 10 minutes out. I'm going to wait till after the workshop, and then I'm just going to hang out in the Discord for anyone that wants to try to work on this program or might want some help or some tips with it. The hint, of course, is that it uses integer overflows. And earlier I mentioned that there was a sort of hint for this later on to get a flag where I mentioned integer underflows. Remember that. But we're going to keep moving on. Why are we talking about this? Does this actually happen? Are programmers this bad? Yes, all the time. And so the question is, what do these three characters have in common? And the answer is integer overflows and underflows, this exact vulnerability. So I'm going to tell you some stories. They're pretty fun. Integer overflows and underflows, when they happen, can be pretty funny. They can also be deadly serious at times. So let's go. Step 1, you might remember this character. He was the young guy in the middle here. That's a young Gandhi, and this is the one that you might know and love. The computer game Civilization, when it came out, you could play as different countries, and these countries had leaders. And one of those countries was India, and the leader of India was Gandhi. You could play against the computer as well, and so the computer had to be able to play as these leaders. And the way to make it more realistic is that you make a leader like Gandhi more peaceful and a leader like, say, Genghis Khan really, really aggressive. And you control that. Yes, so here's what it would look like if you met Gandhi in the game. The way that you control how aggressive these computer players were based on the leader was you gave it an aggression rating. So the aggression rating for Gandhi was 1. Gandhi was very peaceful, very much about nonviolence. So if the computer was playing Gandhi, the computer would not be very aggressive. and this would be more realistic to what you would expect from real life. Unfortunately, if the Indian civilization led by Gandhi as the computer was a democracy and you were a democracy, it would give you a modifier so that Gandhi was less aggressive towards you, because democracies seldomly go to war against each other, at least in theory. So Gandhi would get a -2 modifier. But his aggression level of 1 would then go to -1, which in binary would look like this. And because the game used unsigned integers, Gandhi's aggressiveness rating would instead get turned up to 255. The computer would look at it and would say, that's a big number, not a negative number. And so Gandhi would suddenly become aggressive. And this spawned a lot of memes on the internet that you may have seen and never known what they were about. But this meme became known as Nuclear Gandhi. Gandhi would come and talk to you as the computer and would say that our words are backed with nuclear weapons. And Gandhi could just become wildly aggressive if he had nukes, especially. And this spawned a meme called Nuclear Gandhi. And so you can go on the internet and you can find images like this all over the place. And this is just Civilization players sort of poking fun at the idea that Gandhi would drop nuclear bombs, because of course that's not the way it would happen in real life. A revered figure, I understand. In Civilization 5, they actually made this part of the game. So as an homage to this sort of bug, Gandhi was more likely to try to get nuclear weapons, maybe not use them, but he would like people that got nuclear weapons in that game, the way it was programmed. It turns out, for anyone that might have heard this, that this story might not actually be true about the aggressiveness rating. A bunch of the programmers claim there's no way this actually happened. This isn't the way we stored the numbers. This isn't the way the interpretation happened. Whether or not it was true in Civilization 1, the Nuclear Gandhi thing was put into Civilization 5. So people sort of believed it was true, and then it was put into a Civilization game eventually. But that was all because of an integer underflow. Next is this character. You might not recognize him in this picture here, but this is a South Korean rapper. You might recognize him better here and here. This is Psy. He came out with a little tune back in 2012 that kind of broke YouTube in a way. And the way it broke it was in the way that YouTube stored the number of views. Gangnam Style was the most viewed video on YouTube for the longest time. And at some point, it hit 2.1 billion views, and YouTube revealed that they were storing the number of views with a 32-bit signed integer, which meant that if you got enough people to watch this video, eventually the view count would go here. So YouTube had to update their algorithms, and they now store views using a 64-bit integer, which means that theoretically, using a 64-bit, I believe unsigned, or no, signed, they could go up to this many views. This number is on God. What is that? Million, billion, trillion, quadrillion, 9. What's that? Quintillion, 9.2 quintillion. That's a ton of views. We're probably not going to hit that, but just for fun, if there's 8 billion people in the world and we wanted to push Psy's video over the limit again, each person would have to watch the video 1.15 billion times. So we're not really at risk of overflowing the YouTube view limit anymore. And the last example of integer overflows, and this is the one where things get really serious. This is the Ariane 5 rocket put out by the European Space Agency. This is a workhorse for getting lots of satellites into space. The James Webb Space Telescope rode one of these to get up into space. That was one of the most high-profile things that the Ariane 5 has lifted recently. And the way that this rocket works is that it has 2 computers inside of it. One of them, we'll say the one on the left here, is taking measurements about where the rocket is and where the rocket is going, and what forces are working on the rocket, and sort of which way it's tilted and angled and changes. And it communicates with this other computer over here, which is literally flying the rocket. It's taking the observations of the first computer and saying, if this is where we are, this is how I need to fly to keep going straight up. And those 2 computers communicate. And one time when this rocket went up, something bad happened, which was the computer that was taking all of this data on where the rocket was going and what was happening to it, all the forces acting on it, it had to translate a 64-bit number into a 16-bit number. And it tried to do this, and there was an error in the code. It experienced an error, and the error wasn't handled. And so what happened was the program that was taking all the measurements errored out. And there was no integer overflow, strictly speaking, here. But what it did when this error hit was it printed out a debug message for the programmers saying, this is what happened when the program crashed. It fed that message over to the flight computer over here, which then read the error message as if it was data about the rocket flying. Remember when I said that binary representation can be read as a signed or an unsigned int? You could also read it as characters. You could read it as hexadecimal. Binary can represent a lot of things. So this computer thought it was flight information about the rocket, which was currently in flight after about 35 seconds after takeoff. And when it read that number was very big, or when it read that error message, the error message as a number was very big, so big that it made this computer think that the rocket was not flying up, but instead was flying straight down. And you can imagine what a computer trying to fly a rocket does when it thinks that suddenly, instead of going up, it's going straight down. What it did was it tried to pull a U-turn at a couple of Gs, flying straight up in the air. So the rocket tried to turn over to go what it thought was the right way, but was actually the wrong way around, and this happened. And so this was an example of trying to translate big numbers into smaller numbers using integers that didn't quite work out, and the deadly consequences. The craziest thing about this was that after they investigated it, they found that none of this had to happen. All of this code was left over from the Ariane 4 rocket, and they just hadn't turned it off. They assumed that it wasn't really going to do anything. But because this rocket was so much more powerful, that number got really big that it was measuring, and that caused the overflow. They could have turned this whole program off because it wasn't needed for the rocket to fly at all. But the programmers just left it running because after 40 seconds, it shut itself off. And the rocket tipped over at 35 seconds. So 5 more seconds and everything would have been fine. But an integer overflow caused this rocket to malfunction and explode. This is back in 1996. So these things can be from funny computer games to stories about YouTube to rockets literally blowing up in midair. The attendance. We forgot about the attendance today. For anyone that would like to sign the attendance form, this is our last workshop, but we always like to know who's out there. It helps us understand who our audience is. Here's the QR code. There's the link. Do I have that link available? Let me drop it in the chat. I'm just going to type it in for you guys. Is this going to work? Is this going to be... No, just a second. Let me get you the actual one, folks, because I think my font here is all uppercase, and you need upper and lowercase matter in this. So let me get you that. There we go. That is the actual bit.ly link that you need. So essentially the C and the Y are lowercase if you're signing the attendance form. But that is going to end the playing around with integer overflows. And we are now going to jump to the next thing. Sorry about that. I forgot to erase that. So we're going to go to print string vulnerabilities. Like I said, this is another thing you'll see in Computer Science 525. This will be sort of a soft introduction to how they work. This is all supposed to be just basic information about how these things work. There are, you'll see both of these things in CTFs, integer overflows and print string vulnerabilities. They can get really complicated and you can do a whole lot of stuff with them. The whole point of this is just that you sort of understand the basics of how they work. and you can go out on your own and learn more about them. Or if you see them in a CTF, at least you've got some place to start with them. So printing in the C programming language. The most popular way, and the one you'll see the most often, is the printf function. So here's an example of some code. You have this code. You can run it. This is an example of some code, and this prints in a few different ways. This uses printf in a few different ways, I should say. The first way is this one right here, the hello world print statement. We just pass into printf a string, and printf can print that. The next print statement down here is the same sort of thing. Just give it a string the same way that you would in something like Python. The next way is this. Python is able to do these as well, but we don't tend to do it this way in Python as much. I think these F strings in Python is what they're called. But yeah, this is another way to do this. And to understand what's happening here, we have to understand what these things are, like what's being passed into this printf statement. The first is a format specifier. So you're printing something and you're telling it what the arguments are. And that piece right there is the argument. And what this does is it tells it, print this string, but wherever you see these, insert this argument into this string, this part of the string. So we could write words in here. We could say hello world space and then %s, and it would change the %s with whatever the argument is in buffer. So we've actually seen this in the last little section we did on integer overflows. Remember I said it was printing numbers out as signed and unsigned numbers? The way it was doing that was it was using printf, and you were putting two numbers in, and I called them number 1 and number 2. The first number, I told you to make them the same. The first number was printed as a signed integer, which is %d in the C programming language. And the second one was %u, which is unsigned. So this is just telling C, the programming language, this number here, I want you to interpret it, the binary for it, as a signed integer, or I want you to interpret the number as an unsigned integer. And that's why it could print out two different numbers with the same input, or the same number that you gave it. So that's what it sort of looks like when you try to do that. If you mess these up, you can print numbers out to look different ways, or ways that you didn't really intend for them to be. And the way that you know how what these are is there are nice tables that exist, sort of telling you if you want to print in C, if you want to print like a string, it's %s, or it can be %x for an unsigned integer, or %d for a signed integer. There are different ways of doing this. A nicer table, and the one that I really like, is this one here. So a D or an I for signed decimals. What else do we have? We have X for hexadecimal, octals. We have C, you can print a single character. S will print characters, so it'll look at some binary and it'll say, interpret this binary as characters instead of as numbers. You can print out pointer addresses, which is something we're going to look at a little later. But yeah, there's all sorts of ways to print things out in C using these format specifiers. So we're going to look at what this actually does when you call this. And you're going to have to remember back to our sort of first binary exploit overflow workshop. But the main takeaway, the thing that you're going to have to remember, and this is a good way to impress people with parties, this word, is that printf is a variadic function. Variadic is just a buttery, beautiful word that you can use to, like I said, just impress people by saying that you were working on variadic functions. And anyone who doesn't do a lot of math or computer science will say, "Ooh, that sounds fancy." So tip from me to you, printf is a variadic function. If somebody actually says to you, "Do you even know what that means?" You can say, "Yes, because Jeremy told me that a variadic function is a function that takes a variable number of inputs." So in math or in computer science, a variadic function takes a sort of an unknown number of inputs. It could take 1, it could take 0, it could take 30. The whole idea of this is that it just takes some number of inputs. That's variadic, and printf is a variadic function because, as you can see here, all of these things would print, assuming that there's that these actually represent something. But printf can take one argument, it could take 2 arguments, it could take 3 arguments. Printf has been programmed to take as many arguments as you will give it. I'm not even sure if there's a limit on the number that you can give it, but this is to say that this is a function that doesn't know how many arguments it's going to get, but it can handle a variable number of arguments. That's what we mean by variadic. So we're going to have to look back inside the memory. You might remember this chart from the other binary exploit workshop that we did, the sort of intro to binary exploitation. This just represents the RAM in our computer. And this is going to be our main function. This blue part is the memory that's been reserved for main. Let's pretend now that the printf function gets called to print out whatever this buffer is as a string. So we know that printf is a function. It's getting called. So in the stack, in the memory, memory gets assigned to printf. And I'm sure you remember exactly what gets stored in there. The return address to main when the function is done for where it needs to go back, the frame pointer, and then this buffer variable, the arguments that are being passed, those are put on the stack for that function. And what printf is going to do is it sees that there's a format specifier here, and it says, I need to print something here. Whatever that thing is, it's going to be on the stack. So I'm just going to look at the stack and print out that buffer variable that got passed in when I got started up. So that's great. You might be able to see sort of how this maybe could go wrong. And the sort of way that it can go wrong is, what if you didn't pass an argument into the printf function? What if you just gave it the format specifier? So in this case, if this program ran, the %s goes in, you see that buffer variable disappears, so it doesn't assign any memory to it. So what is this print is the question. And the answer is that printf sees this format specifier and says, I've got to print something from the stack, go to the top of the stack and print what's there. So in this case, it would be this frame pointer, whatever's sitting on the stack. So let's look at this example here. So this is the next way that it prints in this program. In this case, printf is being given no format specifier. It's just being given some sort of argument, or some sort of variable is being passed in. So in this case, it's just the buffer. So it would do the same thing. It would put this thing on the stack, and assuming that there was some thing in the buffer to actually print, it would print that thing out. So now that you know this, you know that the format specifier just prints off the stack. Even if there's nothing put on the stack for it to print, it just starts going through the stack and printing things. We can look back at this program, and you can see right here, this printf, the second way it prints out is using the second way of printing that I showed you. So what this program does is it will say, give me some good old user input. You type something in, it will store that in the buffer, this character buffer, and then it'll print it out for you using these 2 ways of printing. I want you to see if you can get this to print. Try to make it segfault, because you can get it to segfault, and then try to get it to print statements that don't match. So type something in for the user input and see if you can get it to print stuff out that doesn't match. Sort of the same way we did with the numbers. You can give it things to print that aren't going to print the same way twice. So it's not going to print this buffer the same way in both of these print statements. See if you can get it to do that, or figure out how it's doing it. If you figure it out, feel free to toss it into the chat. I'll give you about 2 or 3 minutes to do this. Yeah, it says on the slide, I maybe not have mentioned, this is the printf program that was in the files that I gave you. So there we go. Some good old user input. Jeremy. And then it prints it out twice. So try to get this to print out 2 different things based on the user input. Also try to make it segfault. See if you can remember how to do that. Bit of a hint to help you. Give you 1 more minute. All right, coming back. Pretty quiet in the chat. No one's really said anything. That's okay. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to jump ahead in the slides again. I went way back. Oh, it was on the next. Yeah, sorry. It was the hint on the next slide, of course. So yeah, you could have used these format specifiers to sort of mess the program up a bit. And the idea is that it's going to interpret that percentage sign as a format specifier. So if I pass in my name, it can print a string here, and it can print a string here. Just a regular string in that buffer, in that character buffer. It'll interpret that as just characters to print out. The trick is, and try it again, as soon as I put a percentage sign in there, it interprets the percentage sign as a format specifier, even if it's in the argument that's passed in. So if the thing that's getting passed in the second case here, in this printf buffer, if there's a format specifier in the buffer, the printf function treats that the same way that it treats this right here. It interprets it as, oh, I've got to go get something from the stack and print that, not as the buffer just has %s or %x or %d inside of it. So go ahead and play around with that program for another couple of seconds, see what you can get it to print. Look through these things down here, print out single characters, strings of characters, and then the ones down at the bottom are the sort of the interesting ones. So go ahead and play around with that. And after playing with it, you should be able to get it to print all kinds of weird and wonderful things. By the way, in case anyone didn't see it, the way you get the segfault in this is you just overflow the buffer. That character buffer is only 50 characters. If you do our old trick of just screaming at the program for a little while, I'm not actually passing that in. Scream at the program, not at your command line. Your command line just hates you for doing that sort of thing. Thinks you're just being a jerk. There you go. Program detects stack smashing. That's how you get your segfault. Actually, in this case, you don't get the segfault. I put the stack smashing protection in, so you can't do it there. But the point is, getting back to what we're looking at here, if I put in something like %s, it'll print out %s from the first printf statement, the one with the format specifier. So it knows that this %s in the buffer is to be printed like a string. And this is what the sort of trick is. This is the safest way of printing, because if I put a %s in here, it'll print out the %s. But in the second case where it says printf just the buffer, it looks at what's in the buffer, it sees a %s, and it says, format specifier, print what's on the stack. And it's trying to do that here. You can't see anything, probably because whatever's on the stack at that location is not printable characters. But we can add more than one of these. So we can do %s, %s, %s. This is probably going to segfault. It doesn't. But it does print this null and then h equals. So I could probably do this a few times. And remember, each time it sees one of these, it goes to the stack and it pops something off to print out. So what it's doing right now is it's going back and back through the stack. And yeah, this time it gets a segfault. So the reason it gets a segfault is because it's trying to print out null characters or null bytes or just zeros. And it can't print those. That's where it's supposed to stop printing. And printf crashes sort of on that. There's some stuff going on in the background, but essentially printf will crash when it hits a bunch of zeros when you do this format specifier thing. So yeah, what it's doing here is it's saying, in this case, in the second case, it's looking at all these %s's, and every time it sees one, it says, print the first thing from the stack, second, third, fourth, fifth, and it just goes down and down and down through these. So it's just trying to read through the stack and print whatever's in there as a string. Remember that the S says print it as a string. I could do the same thing, except we could go %x. In this case, everything should be fine. So it's going to print these as hexadecimal now, not as strings. And that's what's in the stack in hexadecimal. I'm leaking the stack to you guys of what's in my computer. There's a whole bunch of these things. And can't see, I don't have my, you have to see what's on the next slide. Yeah. So you've used the format specifier. You've seen what it prints out. The next thing is to try to put 0.8 between the format specifier and whatever type it is. So between the percentage and the format specifier. So for example, try $0.8 and then D. We'll go ahead and give this a whirl. Lowercase. It's supposed to be lowercase. It's because my font here. Yeah, there we go. So is that different is the question from format just D? Yes, it is. So it's actually printing out two different numbers here when I put that 0.8 in. The reason behind this is it's going to print out 8 values. So I could go sort of %0.8D, %0.8D, 8D. Work with this? No. I might have to specify this all as 1. Let me copy that. Yeah, okay. It interprets that differently. But you can do this to read things in different formats. So I could I could do this as, what is that? That's in decimals. I could do this in hex. Could read the values off in hex. Come on, Jeremy, type 8. And it's still not doing it properly. Well, there's something I'm noting wrong here. But this is the way that you can sort of specify how many things you want. Also, remember our chart back here? There were some weird things down at the bottom. You could print pointer addresses. So this would actually print the addresses that are in the memory. So if we do %p, you might recognize this. This looks like a memory address, and that's what it's printing out. So I could go %p. So there's an address here, and then there's no address at the next place. It's nil. So there's something that memory is just probably empty. So let's see if we go 3 back in the stack. Yeah, there's something after that. So first thing on the stack, there's something there, nothing there, something else is on the stack behind it. And what this is doing is printf is leaking stuff from the stack to us. So the moral of the story here is that if you just printf with some sort of variable and the user can control that variable, they can put in these format specifiers in very specific ways to start leaking things from the memory of the machine. The correct way to program in C is to use this way right here. This is the safest way to print in C, because again, it's telling it print what's in the buffer, but even if it's a format specifier, just print it as a string. Just everything in there is a string. Don't interpret it. So that's the value of this. So we went through this. So this is the printf2 program, and this one has a flag in it. That is not the flag. I didn't even put that in for like a single point, so don't even try submitting that flag. It's not worth anything. Although that would have been what I should have done. Should have put it in for a single point. But yeah, this is the second program. You can go ahead and run this. As you can see, I'll just sort of explain what's going on here. So this program is going to print out whatever argument you give to the program. So you're going to run it on the command line as printf2 space and then some sort of argument. And it's going to declare a character array here, or just a string, ucsec, and then there is a flag in here. It's going to be worth 75 points, so big money. It then declares an integer a, which in hexadecimal is dead beef. And then it's going to printf argv at 1, which is whatever you passed in as the argument on the command line, and then a new line. And then it's going to print out the stack for you to see what the stack memory looks like. And the reason it's doing this is to help you. I want you to see what's inside of the stack, and I want you to be able to compare it to what you're printing out. So let me show you what this is going to look like. Increase the size of this. No, it's not increasing. So yeah, let me show you what this looks like. So this is printf2. So if I just run the program with no arguments, it prints out whatever I gave it, which was nothing. And then this is the information that's in the stack. And the reason I'm doing this is because you can see there's all of these weird values here. These are all just hexadecimal. And somewhere in there is this one right here, which says dead beef. That's that number that I put into the stack. This right here, remember these variables are getting put into the stack when the program is run. So that's that dead beef variable in there. Somewhere near that dead beef variable is going to be the flag, the character array that's going to hold that flag. So somewhere one of these possibly is going to be your flag. And what you want to do is give it some sort of argument. So you specify it like this. So let's say 08 as a string, segfault. So whatever the first thing that it prints is probably zeros, and that causes it to segfault. So let's not print it as that. Let's print it as a number. Yep, so there's some number in there, and it looks like it's almost 0. But somewhere in here, in the stack, is this. And then if I do 2 of them, it looks like this. If I put a space between them, does this one do it? Yes. Okay, so if I put them in quotation marks, it interprets it all as one argument. And if I put a space in between these two, it'll print these two things out as with a space between them. And this is going to be the easiest way to sort of interpret this. So it's printing these out as decimals. We can print them out as hexadecimals as well. And this is what they look like as hexadecimals. So you can see this thing here, and you can see where that might be in the stack in this diagram. Once you do that, you can start to print out more things and figure out where you are. And the trick is to try to figure out where that flag is in the stack and to get printf to print it out using only format specifiers. So with that, that's going to be the sort of second challenge. And with that, yeah, that's the end of the workshop. I told you guys this was going to be a faster one tonight. I didn't want to take up a lot of people's time. I know it's the end of the semester. Everyone's busy. But yeah, I'll be hanging out in the Discord if anyone wants some help with these, or if anyone can't quite get them. They're both sort of, these are both, I think, on the easier side for these kinds of vulnerabilities. So you'll see these in CTFs, but these would be sort of easier problems. They can get, I'm sure you know, really complicated. Actually, as a sort of tip on how complicated that they can get, this format specifier, the N right here, if you read what it does, it says nothing printed. So that's a format specifier that doesn't print anything. What it says is the corresponding argument must be a pointer to assigned int. So whatever the argument is has to be a pointer to assigned int. And then the number of characters written so far is stored in the pointed location. And if you're reading that and wondering what that means, like, does that mean that it's actually writing stuff to memory? Yes. The printf function can write stuff into memory. So printf, which is supposed to print stuff out for you from the computer, can also be used to write stuff and manipulate the memory of the computer. And again, this is why this is a security vulnerability. If you print out just using this printf and then the something that the user controls, because if they're really clever, they can start moving around and printing things out from memory, find where they want to change something, and figure out how to change that thing. And they could hijack control of the entire program and even the entire computer doing stuff like this. This is why these print string vulnerabilities are a big problem. But as you guys might know with buffer overflows, let's see. Nope, this is the last workshop. I'm trying to find the files that I took out for this workshop, and I can't seem to find them. If I try to compile, yeah, it was just called files. No, it wasn't, sorry. If I just try to compile the files that are used here, I would get a warning from the compiler. The compiler, when it sees you trying to print something like this, actually goes, hey, don't do that. That's really bad. You should be using format specifiers, and this is a big vulnerability. Some of them will do it. Some of them will stop you. It depends on the compiler. But when I compiled these programs, they gave me some serious warnings about using printf this way. It's fine to do it if you know the user can't control this, or if you have checks on what is inside of it. But in general, try to print using this way with the format specifier in C. With that, I'm going to say that's the end of the workshop. Nice, we got it done in about an hour and a bit. So yeah, I'm going to hang out in the Discord if anyone wants to take a look at those programs if you've tried them and you can't quite figure them out. But yeah, thanks for coming. Everyone, good luck with exams and the end of the year. It's almost done. Proud of all of you. Thanks for hanging around with us tonight. Don't forget, if you're in Calgary and want to come to our meeting next week, to please sign that form that we posted in chat. And yeah, hopefully we get to meet lots of you next week in person, even some of the executives that I've worked with for a year and never actually met in person. But everyone have a great evening. Alex, I can see you. Is there anything else that you wanted to say?
I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Yeah, with that, everyone have a great night, and we'll talk to you later. Thanks, everyone.